Hello everyone, today we talk about Frederick the Great Prussian regimental organization, so a look at the infantries of the Hohenzollerns during the second half of the 18th century. That surely is our first video, in fact, on Frederick's times in the first place. So as you know, I have decided recently to look a bit more at properly modern warfare, both early and late, and we will surely revive a bit of contemporary warfare too, so that hopefully in the future we will start, packing enough information about each of these eras. Now, today we talk essentially about the order of the Prussian infantry during Frederick's reign, right? We'll make other videos. Today's a bit about the the organic, the array, partly also the equipment, but mostly also the step of how they mentally and physically combined the order right on the field. We will make other videos about fire, about hand-to-hand combat, which also was actually a thing, right? Surely less often than musketry fire exchanges, but still very present, and especially in these large battlefields as they start really to become. And as we will see also because of the substantially muscular dimension of Prussian infantry that was so for different reasons that we will see now are very political in nature, right? The array of the formation was thicker. They tried to pick also to make some physical selection, but in general it was the strategic means of Prussia that we'll see it better perhaps in another video, that required a specific order, right? In the mid-18th century, thanks to, for Prussia, Frederick II, the tactics of land engagement in Europe changed markedly, right? And this will again deserve to be analyzed here on Schwerpunkt in the due detail, right? Especially as far, in fact, as infantry is concerned, right? Also because it was naturally the most important arm, but still within a synergy with the others, of course. So the first tactics treatise for infantry was printed in Prussia by Frederick William I. We are in 1714, so pretty early on, and as we will see, there is some continuity with the order dating to, in fact, the War of Spanish Succession that Prussia had joined in 1712. Another reglement was spread in 1726, and on June the 20th, 1742, Saint Frederick II, Frederick the Great, created one of his own. Right, that Frederick is really an iconic figure in many ways, and he had a very meticulous approach to warfare, to, of course, the Prussian military as a mean of affirmation, but also survival, based on notions of substantial strategic and tactical aggressiveness. So it is really a big step in 18th century warfare. We have often commented on also in the von Clausewitz series, not just because Karl Philipp Gottlieb was a Prussian, but because objectively Frederick had made school, right? This is the guy at the tomb of whom Napoleon, after having marched on Prussia, having annihilated the Prussian army, said to his staff, pay homage, meant because, if this guy here had been alive, we, the French, wouldn't be here. Naturally, I will dedicate some specific videos to the battles of Frederick the Great, at least some of them. Hopefully we will cover them all, but these are, milestones that we have to observe one by one, because every battle is different, every strategic context, and every army are as well, so there is a continuous change, right? Frederick was one of the few lucky sovereigns that after a nightmarish, half of his at least reign had secured such a strategic success to eventually leave peacefully for the second half, right, and improving also the condition of his country and so on. One of the enlightened sovereigns, even though not quite in the sense that he bought much of the Enlightenment, was extremely rigid, and this rigidity was useful, right? It's important to know how to adapt, but without a backbone, you really go nowhere, civilizationally speaking, either. And Frederick's regulations of 1742 would become effectively the base of the instructions of the following year that would have eventually been republished with just minor changes in 1750, 59, 66, 73, and 83. Right? There is all the literature here. Again, they're easy to find, and they're interesting to read. Right? However, one should. We don't have time. We will read some source today here and there, but the most important thing, at least for a video like this, is pointing out that a good number of evolutions that the infantry had be able to perform and was thus also trained for were considered too important to be divulgated by the press. There wasn't any magic secret maneuver that others couldn't perform, but there were, at least doctrinally speaking, some intuitions naturally that were part a bit of the military theory of these countries that they legitimately wanted to remain in their hands, and not someone else's. And as we will see now, and this is one of the single most important aspects, I would think, in approaching 18th century warfare, is that what happened on the battlefields with linear tactics was not really the extremely geometrical, inflexible, immutable order that we sometimes also get from those times, or the geometric precision of the sciences of there was a bit of an idea, fascination behind that. We know that well because we've seen from Clausewitz how the principle, for example, of internal lines, the Jomini's work and worldview were pretty much shared by the 18th century staffs, and especially in Frederick's time, they were affirming themselves substantially. But that was just like something. First of all, we are tricked into thinking that generals would actually reason like themselves in the terms of at the time, and that would be literally enacted on the field, right? But breaking formation for reaching a position faster, even just common brawls rather than bayonet charges or whatever, pretty unorthodox kind of type of maneuvering on the field, was naturally present, right? It's not just that war is chaotic, but there are literally some positive actions that you can take only if you break this. It is true that the Prussians were the single most rigid ones of all, that they basically had their aristocracy decimated for things like, I don't know, they had to march always at that precise step, even if this would have exposed them for a longer time unnecessarily in a contingental way to enemy fire, right? That they could have simply, a trait they could have simply gapped by running, right? But the point of the Prussian military quality that affirms itself at this point as essentially the top in Europe with ups and downs, there's no continuity, as we were saying before, just look at the Napoleonic Wars, at least in the early phase, and then von Scharnhorst and the other, thinkers, of course, and we know, you know my avatar in general, but would create a completely different thing, and I will make hopefully lots of videos about that specific topic. In general, however, things could go different on the field with thousands of men that are also naturally complicated to control. And this is the point. Other practice, right? Other, say, maneuvers, evolutions, etc., that are, in fact, widely illustrated in the treatises and were actually carried out on the parade grounds would only rarely be carried out on the battlefield, right? If you read, for example, the 39 Handgriffe of the training manual of the Prussian army, the various types of square, the regular platoon fire, the diagonal movement in order to switch from, column to battle line, were actually performed or probably not even performed technically in the way they were exposed there, right? For many reasons. Now we don't have time to digress in, but you understand that if you had enough time in certain circumstances, maybe exactly because you didn't have enough time, right, things would go in another way. There were some essentials though that today we will take a look at, right, in terms of probably what the manpower really was, how consistent the units were, how they were ordered, who watched over them, how they were organized depending on the situation, and how fast they stabbed, how what their array was, their order was, and so on. So the Prussians maintained until November the 29th, 1740, the 4 ranks deep formation adopted during the War of Spanish Succession, right? When Frederick ordered to the regiments marching towards the Silesian front to adopt the 3 ranks deep formation. And this one would be extended to the entire army on June the 20th, 1742. Right. This caused interesting consequences because when during the 7 Years' War the Prussian recruits began to run short, sort of avant-gardistic system on only 2 ranks was emergentially adopted. In fact, as soon as the recruitment crisis was surpassed, the 3rd rank was readily reestablished, because a 3rd line of fusiliers specifically augmented the battalion firepower and constituted a reserve for, naturally, just the 1st rank, especially the very first, where the tallest men were located, because, as we will see now, it was more important actually to present a fearsome facade than even taking casualties, or at least there was a balanced ratio, right? These men, also because they were taller, not just because they were in the 1st rank, would intercept, of course, against their will or their hope, let's say, the majority of the enemy projectiles during an engagement, right? And the presence of tall and robust men served in 18th century warfare, where you have still naturally smoothbore firearms, and so you have actually a relatively, what matters is the volume of fire as such, not specifically the precision or even just the penetration capacity, the joules that damn projectile really has, but you don't have to kid with. But again, you can show off, right? It's important even for commanders to be readily identifiable, right? And having this 1st rank of tough looking soldiers provides with probably a sense of compact, of cohesion, of solidity, both for the the enemy, the most important, but also for the guys behind, right, that were following the men in the front, right? So this was a psychological expedient, naturally, and everything about warfare is really about that, about trying to scare the enemy and reassuring the friend, right? And so also the pretty colorful, kind of scenographic, we can't say, uniforms of 18th century warfare. Now, an infantry regiment of the Prussian army of the mid-18th century was a community of about 1,700 men. 50 officers, 160 NCOs, 40 musicians, very important, a dozen of, at least among doctors, doctor assistants, and other personnel for the administration, what was known in German as Unterstab. We're talking about clerks, a treasurer, an almoner, an auditor, a privat, and so on, which would leave, on paper, 1,430 privates. Right. In the Prussian army, the line infantry was distinguished in musketeers and fusiliers regiments. Now, there's not a dramatic difference, as we'll see now. That essentially the fusil is actually a musket, just is a more slender one, a lighter one, and it was generally speaking adopted by infantry that was thought to be, in fact, lighter, in a general sense. Was, just to make an example, native, let's say, for example, in North America, native troops would normally and more likely use this kind of gun as opposed to the musket, right? And there is a bit of this colonialistic mentality, even within the same Europe, because the musketeers regiment were recruited within the historical territories governed by the Hohenzollern, and they were immediately recognizable by their tri-horn of black felt. The Fusiliers regiments adopted the same identical tactics of the musketeers, but they were recruited principally from the provinces of more recent acquisition, such as Silesia. Given we're talking about the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, etc. Now, Frederick was convinced that essentially the people living outside of the traditional lands, of Pomerania and Brandenburg, were shorter, right? There was a sort of eugenetic principle behind the idea of of national, you can say, Prussian infantry, right? And the other troops were instead equipped with, again, fusils, right? So with guns of simply smaller size, and wore them with a beret, a cap, fundamentally decorated with metallic plaques, definitely similar to the ones worn by the normal grenadier companies, so that they would at least look kind of taller, in spite, again, of this idea that in Frederick's mind, the not just his, evidently, the other peoples were somehow shorter, than his Pomeranians and his Brandenburg. And this interesting thing is also described by some sources that say that this cap seemed really impressive when the sun shone over Fusiliers battalion. Their look is the one of a sort of defiling robust palisade, right? And even seen from the rear, these caps were quite aesthetic because of the colored cloth that covered the top, right? Then the regiment, here we will see also a bit more in depth, was divided into battalions of equal strength, and as it happened in many armies of the time, the battalion had two separated administrative and tactical administrations, respectively. And from an administrative point of view, every unit counted 6 companies of musketeers and 1 of grenadiers. And in case of of emergency, the latter could be also split, and the 5 companies of musketeers form 4 divisions of 2 platoons, each for a total of 8 platoons. We will see it now better. Now, the battalion was essentially the basic tactical unit of the Prussian army. It was deployed on 3 ranks, as we've seen, of 200 men each. So we're talking about 600 soldiers, with a front thus of 130 meters, right, and a depth of less than 2 meters. Do you understand how compact this array was, how physical, right, and how considered this man had were almost all equipped with a musket. So the volume of fire was quite concentrated, and this is still the deal. In fact, of linear tactics of the smoothbore area, the battlefield is full, right? You have some units that have to punch each other, right? If before they firearms they did it with pikes, with swords, whatever. At this point they did it with muskets, and it was basically the same. You had to maintain cohesion. You wouldn't suffer more casualties by opening the order, because that would have diluted your firepower, and as a consequence you would have been actually destroyed much more easily. Again, I always remind you that we live in a world of adults that seem to actually believe that anything that is going straight against the enemy under fire and firing back is madness. Actually, is the single most logical military thing you can do, and this was true for Frederick the Great's time, just like in World War I. So if you still leave thinking that that was madness, well, there may be some severe problems at the roots, not just in the complete failure of the understanding of what the military instrument for politics really is, and what concretely strategy and tactics really are, and what's their point of connection, but something actually much more ancestral. Look at your household. Look at how you got educated, if you did, by any degree, and start posing yourself some very serious questions about your general upbringing, because it is not normal to be an adult person not being able to understand this concept, right? And or especially to refuse to make a minimal mental effort in claiming some sort of moral dignity, essentially, for understanding to be morally inferior than a person that can simply instead understand this stuff and feeling annoyed by it, right? So as a military historian, I particularly feel for such things, and I'm not going even to explain linear tactics in this video, but this is actually the idea for one, because at least we can make a bit of clarity. So the internal repartition of the battalion was the 8 platoons, as we've seen, the Zuga, right, of 75 men each, that were capable of covering a front of 16 meters. The division, as we have seen before, was the combination of 2 platoons. So 150 men, definitely compact formations on the field, and as Jean-Antoine Hippolyte de Guibert had understood in his travels across the reign of Prussia, Frederick the Great appreciated the units deployed in such thick order, not just for the tactical advantages that derive from that, but also for the necessity of maintaining his pluriethnic infantry under the strict control of a rigid discipline. This aspect is particularly crucial because, again, you will see now what it really meant to have such closed order on the battlefield, because you could literally have all the lines compressing themselves at a point. They had to will about the wings towards the external to put things in order carefully, because the order was everything naturally. But again, this moral reason, the fact that, of course, most Prussian forces came not just from properly non-Prussian lands, but also literally from other countries. It was full of French, Polish, Italian soldiers that were just, again, as most men at this point in 18th century armies. I made a video about the gang presses, I don't know, for the Royal Navy, etc. We were literally the scum of the earth. I mean, people fleeing from their countries for whichever reason, whatever. You have the beautiful rendition by Kubrick of Barry Lyndon that speaks of that, and the misery, of course, of these people's background, the incredibly brutally traumatic discipline that was imposed with severely harsh punishments, etc. Because, again, at this point, the state starts having, like in Prussia, in Austria especially, consolidating at this point after France and Britain and other countries being essentially along the same pattern. Literally that force of literally smashing the hell out of the subject, of the individual, right? You have to impose this traumatically violent collective discipline, because that's how armies work, right? Objectively, there is nothing, I think, like human dignity without collective discipline in the history of civilization, and this is what actually speaks of the greatest armies in the history of mankind. The idea of keeping this men just close to each other, we'll see there were some NCOs, as always, in all formations historically, to keep always an eye behind the formation, not to avoid fugitives running away and so on, but properly keeping all these men packed so that they could not just have deliver greater firepower per meter of front, let's say, for length of front, but just also because they were easier just to keep in the formation, right, and making them less likely to break, because these troops were not very nationally amalgamated. As we've seen, they were essentially, I'm against the term conceptually because there is no difference, but in fact they were mercenaries, right? Because there is no difference between a mercenary and a soldier in the first place. The first name is just a derogatory one for actually calling how still the best troops, like professional soldiers, paid adequately for it and for a specific reason, because otherwise you wouldn't pay them so much, are there to kill and getting themselves killed in the process. Now, the battalion and the platoon were surrounded by a screen of officers and NCOs that had three essential tasks. The first one was to provide the unit with the alignment and the right direction while in movement. This was crucial because, again, we were just talking about the Battle of Leuther the other day and saying actually that the oblique order of Epaminondas had nothing to do with the concept, the strategic and tactical concept of the oblique order of Frederick II. But, as you know, a big deal in this time of 18th century warfare was practically trying to outflank the enemy, to fall at least, with an indirect from a direction that would deny the full the full deployment of enemy firepower, and so taking out the enemy line in detail by concentrating the size of force there. This required an enormous deal of training, and an enormous deal, in fact, of repetition, for which the Prussian discipline was famous, in virtue of her unspeakable brutality that brought beautiful, I mean, literally aesthetically speaking, results on the battlefield, and also concrete results, given the what remains outside from the miracles of the House of Brandenburg in terms of actual military capacity. And again, the casualty rate of the Prussian, like of the Junkers during the 7 Years' War, is something like 70%, something unspeakable. That even favored in perspective, because the nobility was almost taken out in the process. The degree by which the Hohenzollern at this point were able to enforce properly a statal power, a motivation. It was, there a struggle for survival mostly that surely played its part, but it was also about literally, having an army could be kept together, and you can't have even just how the Prussians behaved on the battlefield without that capacity, right? You can have scared troops, but you also have to train them, in fact, in order to overcome that fear. Aside from the political motivations, there is a military technique behind that. Another thing we will see better in another video was, another task was controlling fire, right? And everything got very messy, right? Because especially after the first volley, it was not just the muskets were very imprecise in general, and it was still essentially a zone shooting. But this happened because after the first volley, just was like a fog on the battlefield due to powder, and you just had to loosely shoot in a direction, right? For which you would hopefully be trained to at least hit at a meant height. But definitely the most important and the most, probably from one side moral, charismatic, but also very physical, muscular task was maintaining the unit together, right? And to this purpose, the NCOs were provided with a half pike, the Kurzgewehr, that was wielded horizontally behind the soldiers' backs as a true and proper barrier in order to prevent from fleeing or just sudden withdrawals, but keeping the formation still being pushed back, or also as a weapon just to kill any fugitive that would break, in fact, the formation and try to escape, which was done very, very easily, right? We have accounts of very famous generals like, Prince Eugene, just, shooting, cold-bloodedly, just the guy breaking the rank. It was a completely, it is technically still a completely normal thing, if you, consider the implications of it. And that helped a lot to stiffen the, to discipline. Having guys with these pikes that if you try to escape, and they are also experienced, like the NCOs, they really make most of the job there. They are some of the toughest motherfuckers you can imagine. And they will not hesitate to trespass you and leave you there dying, whining like a bitch, right? And that's exactly what their task was. And things naturally could get quite dangerous for themselves. I mean, at some point, some units would break anyway. But the function in all armies was the same. It had been the same since since antiquity. Now, the first document that prescribes the cadenced pace in the Frederican army is dated May the 2nd, 1747, when just an issue recommended to march at 90-95 paces a minute at the beginning of a tactical advance, right? Meaning that, this is where the troops were sent properly into combat directly in front of them. But the same issue reminded that 70-75 paces a minute were already fast enough, right? So this was type of march that had also just to instill, like to warm up the men. It was a psychological combination here, and as you understand here, this is just a regulation, but the various commanders would adopt certain specific, in fact, say varieties of speed, in part just out of their personal preference, if they were especially coordinated with other units, etc. And as I was saying before, like it would have not been strange even to see some troops there's literally even break information in attack, depending on the terrain, depending on the enemy, whatever, to seize the moment, any tactical opportunity. There was also a faster march of 120 paces a minute that, however, was not designed for combat, right, for the attack, but for the movements of passage from column to line. But although the general movements seemed like slow and solemn, as were so accurate that there is no time wasted in kind of fixing or correcting the distances, and this would make the troops essentially reaching their objective faster, right, than the others. And in fact, the same Frederick II was commenting on these ideas, made it a question of principle that infantry, for infantry to arrive in a useful time to the objective, in fact, marching slowly, right, while it was rather cavalry that had to carry that out in the fastest way possible, right? And this tactical principle may have been inspired naturally by that very specific Prussian thought of economy of forces, given again the circumstances. This, after all, still secondary power surrounded by giants like, I don't know, Russia, France, Austria, and so on, and having to care very, very much about probably the essential elements of the army. So you would essentially rely on this granitic infantry that had to hopefully always march even in a overly cautious way, but to maintain cohesion at all costs, because as we've seen in other videos also about Napoleonic warfare, where the essential, at least about the three arms, is a bit the same. Like infantry can do everything. Infantry is the decisive weapon practically, and at least has an advantage over the other two arms. So cavalry here is, in the Prussian mentality, just used surgically to just even amaze the enemy, saying, okay, there is an opportunity there to exploit. Let's not waste that either, because actually Prussia didn't have much of a strong cavalry until Frederick's time, and was actually quite nervous when had to confront the Austrian one. In fact, there is the Hohenfriedberger March. Famously enough, some say it was the same Frederick that was as a musician, and also a good one actually. Maybe the same composer, at least of, I don't remember whether of the motive or of the lyrics, but in any case, because that was a big deal in the first place for the Prussians to defeat Austrian cavalry, because they had a few, and so they had to keep it jealously in store until the right moment, when cavalry had to seize immediately the opportunity. Had to be, in fact, carefully thought. Naturally, also cavalry requires a specific order, right? Going too fast also for cavalry is detrimental, right? But again, as I was saying before, mostly when you punch, and this is typical, we've seen it in many videos, even, I don't know, commenting on the Strategicon of the 6th century, right? That there were some, throughout all history, there were some armies, there were certain tactical situations for which speed and concentration of numbers in a given place was just preferred over the same order of the units, right? Especially with flank attacks, etc., where if you were in the condition of carrying them out, especially in the critical moment of the engagement, the important is to carry them out very fast, not to waste time, because you may lose the moment, and so you have to be really timely about that. With infantry, it's different. That's the anvil. In many ways, it's not quite. I mean, it has a substantial firepower, so it's a bit of a hammer too. But given again the Prussian background, you understand why Frederick would be mostly about this general principle between the two arms. Consider this for infantry, that the Prussian pace of the 18th century was very different from the Goose one adopted later, that became a bit of a meme of Prussia herself and of Germany, because in Frederick's times the legs were maintained very rigidly, right, with in fact the shoe's sole almost to not even to graze the ground, right, and every let's say even attempt of smashing violently the foot on the ground was discouraged, right? So it's as if there had to be immediately a fixity, right? That could not be altered in any way. They didn't have to even waste necessary energies in that way. As we've seen, also the array was pretty thick, right? Which means that basically soldiers touch each other's shoulder while marching, right? And this was done, as we've seen, for mostly reasons of morale. The troop had to maintain this order, the reciprocal support, the common effort, right? So this touch could and would not be renounced too. Because it was really functional to it was the during the action, right? The principle mean to preserve the order, which is, if you think about it, a pretty simple but obvious concept, right? If you are able to maintain that proximity with a guy next to you on your side, you can't be wrong, right? You know, if everybody does the same, that cohesion remains. So for whichever reason on that battlefield, where you can't really imagine people next to you exploding in pieces, literally, but smashed by a cannonball, or, you know, being pierced by the mitraille, or, you know, advancing, as we've seen in the smoke, under artillery fire, all the things you can imagine under musketry fire. And with this pretty also delicate balance. I mean, these armies, yes, there were some reserves, double lines sometimes, but generally speaking, linear tactics is really like that, because those ranks were basically the entire depth of the army, right? At least in a useful tactical way. Those three men are the entire depth, right? And this tells you also, you know, how powerful that firepower really was, in fact, to prevent also cavalry more often than not from breaking through and so on. But that cohesion with a man next to you is basically all you have, right? And the one in depth is also important, but it has mostly to do with if the rank in front of you is well orderly and they all do the same, because they also basically coordinate each other due to this proximity, you also can do better yourself. And naturally, in this musketry fire, you know that orderly volleys were crucial, because you can shoot the same amount of bullets in the same amount of time. But one thing is, shooting them one all together, and one, scattering them. There were different platoon fire tactics, we will see that, but generally speaking, the most important thing was causing the greatest damage in interest of time, right? Even if cadenced, as we've seen, with the same amount of fire delivered in a given amount of time, that this fire had to be compressed in a single instant, because that would disrupt much more the enemy morale in relative terms, and also its cohesion between the lines, because you have this volley, you have the guy that, as we've seen, was touching your shoulder falling. That is an issue, right? You can't have the guy next, behind, taking his place, but generally speaking, it would begin to shatter the formation by some degree. So, again, never underestimate in this sense the how non-static these fights really were. Yes, these guys could remain hours under enemy musketry fire and seeing everybody dying around. They were trained exactly for that, right? Maintaining the order. But in many ways, that cohesion was functional also to the same advance, the same physical, to the idea that if you had to eventually settle things with cold steel, a bayonet charge had to be carried out with men that were habituated just to maintain that cohesion during the attack itself. So it was all functional to that, again, fanatic Prussian mentality that would prefer even getting some greater amount of casualties during all these maneuvers, during the under enemy fire, etc., but still maintaining the overall cohesion of the formation, because that could really be even more important, right? When eventually they had to punch the enemy, whether with bullets or bayonets later on the field, when they would respond themselves. So that is really important. There is an interesting passage from the former sergeant Johann Conrad Müller, which tells directly from the ranks that, quote, as soon as the drum beat the march, all the troops at the same time raise their left foot, with the men of the left, the right wing, here we're talking about the platoon, that look left towards the flag, while the ones on the left look right. Furthermore, the troops remain shoulder contact, but without pushing towards the center. In other words, here there were within the platoon, like there was an ideal center, and the idea is that more or less the tendency was that they didn't have shields, so the like in antiquity, I say that because especially the Neopolitic armies, as you know, tended to tilt towards the right during the advance, because they would tend to cover. So this thing, they were just trained just either to squeeze on the right or the left. Like if you were on the left side from the center, you would press right, and if you were from the left side of the center, you would press from the right side of the center, you would push left, right? So the idea is that in the center, you could have some excessive squeeze. And this, the sergeant says, Müller says, could happen, right? If men crowd themselves towards the center, the necessary space is regained by tilting gradually the right wing towards the right and the left towards the left. So basically, again, opening towards the sides, right, the respective sides, and thus kind of decompressing the center. And Müller stresses, says, I say gradually because dangerous gaps, bear in mind, that is the only thing here that is described as dangerous, right? Being crowded in the center is not as dangerous, even though it could definitely cause disorder, but the most important thing here to avoid is gaps, right? So you see here, like Frederick said, everything has to be slow as far as infantry is concerned. because he says if this right and left wing try to do the same thing at the same time, they may create a gap just in between at the same time. And if one or two platoons distance each other, so here in the bigger formation, instead of stopping suddenly, they must slow down and maintaining this pace until the line is not reformed. Right? This is exceptional too. So everything, if any accident, again, a battlefield is not a basketball field. It's not just all flat. It's not just all, again, if there's been musketry fire recently, you literally don't see shit. So if you have just this, as we've seen, long formations, with wider, even some tens of meters, you could literally not see through the mist. And all you have to do is to maintain cold blood and gradually just moving in a way that realigns the formation without sudden changes. Even if at this point, this is particularly crucial, even if there is a gap there between the two lines, still this gap doesn't have to be gapped, in fact, at the expense of the unit cohesion. Because say, oh my god, run, because those guys are ahead of us. Yeah, it can be dangerous to have that separation, but the most dangerous thing is if you lose your internal order and formation. Right? If you don't walk with the guy on your side, pressing on your shoulder. And this had to be maintained. Like how this again, is really a constant, and that's how the Prussian regiments were trained, right, regularly. Now, in all this, the musket with, by the way, the bayonet always fixed. This was another Prussian thing, right? It was, at least not literally always, but at least the idea that this thick array was also functional to just engage in hand-to-hand combat, because you would have had also again, this was not just about the array, it was a bit about all the background of this Prussian culture. But again, the idea is that you had to be able to exploit, in spite of this slow marches we've seen, every kind of tactical opportunity. And so again, as far as bayonet charges, again, I will make a video specifically on it, is concerned, even in there, the thing we know, it's much more moral than anything. If after a musketry fire exchange, and everybody exhausts themselves, dead, wounded, tired, consumed by adrenaline, etc., one formation still has the guts to fix bayonet. Here the Prussians always maintain it. Maybe that really gave them an edge, because it was also, in this sense, a heavier musket you were handling. But the idea is that if you just are willing to attack the bayonet, the enemy from on the other side is most likely breaking before contact, right? Because it shows that you are so morally superior at that point that really, there is no match. So this depends on the circumstances. Just the Prussians were preferably instructed to be and trained to be readier to that than others, right? Which was, again, also a way to probably just surpass, again, if you have especially a thicker line, if you have a narrower front in this sense, as we've seen, the idea is that there is a greater proclivity, a greater advantage in charging in hand-to-hand combat, simply because the enemy is not as in such a close order like that to just compensate on the front like the same amount of men. So rather than standing there getting shot at, if you have this advantage, you can't say create a big gap in the enemy line, but just making it fall. with this bayonet attack, and this was also in part what, again, it's a matter of toughness. Basically, in Europe, everybody fought in the same identical way without distinctions. The problem is how much proclivity would there be doctrinally and consequently also for how the entire system was designed to record to that, to record to bayonet charge. That was not something overbearingly frequent in general during in linear tactics. Now, in the musket was maintained as much as possible vertical, with the barrel exposed frontally. Right, the weapon was held by the left vambrace bent perpendicularly under the pointer and holding the butt with the fingers. And having, by the way, to reload sometimes during the march, the soldier moved himself with a kind of hopping pace, essentially bending the knee and placing the heel on the line of the previous step. This, again, you should have seen it, but this is what was really prescribed, and things could happen in very different ways, again, depending on the troops, depending on the units, on the situation, whatever. But, right, everything was, at this point, in a substantial condition of symmetry in Europe, as far as basically they fought all in the same way. You understand, even thinkers like Jomini, etc., that were looking at these geometric aspects as a way of how do we functionalize that better. Of course, that's not wrong. What is wrong is assuming that just by doing that you will win, right? Because war is a much more chaotic mess in that regard, where it's really about moral forces that really manage to embrace everything and to permeate everything and to mostly making the difference. And you understand in this regard that as identical the armies are, also they basically all do the same thing. So what actually comes as a difference comes from a background that is not literally that technical one, but one that allows some armies to do something different from others. And this is why the Prussian one is so fascinating. But again, we will look at Prussian infantry under fire and delivering fire and fighting with cold steel. Then we'll have also to talk about artillery, because that had a fundamental role. There is really a lot about Frederick the Great military thought, right? Properly the concept of battle as instrument of strategy that may seem obvious as a concept, and of course it already existed, but was being theorized in a much more complete way, also given what the strategic objectives of Prussia really were, right? So from one side you have the Prussian oblique order, then you have from the other side the Austrian convergent columns, too, which is, do you simply defeat people because you use an oblique order? Obviously not. Everybody can do that. The point is, how, and how good you are at making it or not. So there are so many beautiful battles where you can analyze these things, but I don't know, Leuth and Kunersdorf, etc., Zupitz. We will look at these battles, and also how really bloody destructive they actually were, because people got massacred, right? And especially during the musketry fire exchanges prolonged during it. But I mean, it was a pretty gruesome thing, and we'll have to talk in severely concrete terms about linear tactics in 18th century warfare. So this was like a little beginning in something more specific. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.